Hello everyone and welcome to the first video of 2023 on the VUCA Insights channel. My name is John and today we're going to talk about China reopening. Yes, in a big way on the 8th of January 2023. We're going to talk about why tourism is important to Malaysia, some historical data on segmental spending by tourists. We're also going to examine the potential beneficiaries if the China tourists come back in droves. So stay till the end of the video to find out my thoughts and do share your opinion on who else did I miss out. As a disclaimer, this video is purely for educational purposes only. It's not a buy or sell recommendation, and if you do need financial advice, please do speak to a licensed planner or fund manager. So China reopens in a big way on the 8th of January. This has been eagerly awaited globally because the lack of Chinese tourists has actually impacted a lot of economies, and not just tourists. It's actually business and entrepreneurs trying to enter into China. It has been a big hindrance. So beginning on the 8th of January, even local authorities, have been stripped of the power to shut down entire communities from early this month. And the decision is quite a big U-turn from the zero COVID policy that China has been practicing in the past. Eagerly awaited. Most of you who have followed business news have certainly noticed the Foxconn public outlash, their workers being locked in dormitories and actually revolted. So something positive coming out of China in the first month of this year. If we look at it from the angle of tourist arrivals and receipts in Malaysia, if we look back historical data, first half of 2019, tourists actually spent roughly about 42 billion in Malaysia alone. So if you multiply that or prorate it by 2, tourists roughly spend about 84 billion in terms of receipts for Malaysia. If we look at the ranking of tourist receipt spend, the Singaporeans are right at the top, 12 billion, followed by Chinese, roughly about 7.1 billion. But do remember, Singapore has a geographical advantage where a lot of these tourists can actually drive into Malaysia, whereas the Chinese mainly have to fly into Malaysia. In terms of highest expenditure per capita, the Saudi Arabians actually took first place, 12,000 per person, right? China is probably at the fourth, about 4.5K. But even then, if I look into the historical data, which I'll show you shortly after this, don't underestimate the spending of the Chinese tourists, because what they don't make up in terms of spending power, they make up in terms of scale. How much does Malaysia rely on tourism? Well, during COVID, it actually dwindled by 20 times. I repeat, 20 times. What do I mean? If you look at historical data going back to 2018, tourist arrivals roughly about 26 million, and receipts, tourist receipts, 86 billion. In 2021, at the height of the COVID pandemic with all these lockdowns, it is only received 240 million in terms of tourist receipts. You've seen so many tourists or tourist-related companies actually go down. I have relatives in Sabah that are involved in this line, and they're saying it's tough. They survive, but it's really, really tough, relying on domestic tourism for the time being before the inbound tourist starts coming back. And substantial hit to Malaysia's economy. This chart actually shows a little bit more granularity on tourist arrivals and receipts. So we start off with right to the left, 2018, Singapore tops tourist arrivals as well as receipts, roughly about 11 million and 27.3 billion in terms of receipts. But if you look at China, 3 million arrivals, which is probably 1/4 of that of the Singaporean arrivals. But in terms of receipts, 12.3 billion. So roughly half of that of Singaporean receipts, but then only with 1/4 of the same number of tourists. So picture this, even though they are not right at the top, but they spend more than their Singaporean counterparts. Obviously, Singapore, they come in more often. I think they pay for more services rather than shopping. And I think that's where these numbers are actually skewed more towards China spending more than the Singaporean guys. So if you fast forward all the way to 2021, in terms of arrivals, my goodness, 10.6 million in 2018 over here. And in 2021, you're talking about 16,000 people. So what is the impact to the tourism sector? I can only imagine. I mean, I've never studied the business or the industry as much because there's not many listed companies that are involved in that space. Yeah, it looks encouraging that from January till July, when the borders reopen this year, it's 1.8 million for Singapore, but the Chinese are still way behind. You're talking about what, 59,000 as comparatively to about 3 million in 2018 and in about 3 million in 2019. So yeah, I guess we're all looking forward to this. Let's now look at the contribution of tourism to the GDP as well as the economy. In 2019, 240 billion was actually added, value added to the tourism industry. They contributed as an industry about 15.9% to the GDP, not small at all. And if you fast forward to 2021, a lot of the tourism contributed value was actually what I call domestic tourism rather than inbound tourism, foreign tourists. Only contributed about 17.9 billion. Yeah, it's stark contrast to 240 billion. The main components of inbound domestic expenditure actually fell into these three pots: passenger transportation, food and beverage, and more niche is country-specific tourism services, which I'll talk about later. But more importantly, if we were to look at the tourist spend, bulk of spending was actually shopping. Food and beverage make up the other parts, and automotive fuel, because a lot of them actually drove rather than flew. Cuti Malaysia, we have good highways in West Malaysia. Not as much in Sabah and Sarawak, but hopefully soon with the Pan Borneo Highway coming up. But yeah, there you go. Big contrast between 2019 and 2021. As mentioned earlier, one of the buckets that tourists actually spend on is passenger transport. And the usual suspects of flight is actually Capital A, or formerly known as Asia. We can't invest in Malaysia Airlines because it's government owned by the Ministry of Finance. So therefore, only public listed one in Malaysia is Capital A. They've definitely seen better times. 2019 revenue of about 12 billion. Net income was negative, but positive operating cash flow about 2.5 billion. 2020 and 2021, challenging times for them, obviously. And in 2021, their losses actually narrowed, from 5.1 billion in 2020 to probably about 3 billion in 2021. They're definitely looking forward to the borders reopening. China definitely will contribute to this. Even in 2022 with domestic travel, if any one of you have flown domestically, you notice that the planes are full, tickets are actually more expensive these days to travel. For me, I'm just a victim of buying the Chinese New Year tickets back to my hometown, and wow, it was definitely not cheap. And I think we can't invest in Malaysia Airlines, obviously, but this is one proxy that can benefit from the inbound Chinese tourists going forward. Another potential beneficiary, Genting Malaysia. The Chinese love to gamble, and if there is something to entertain their family and children while they're gambling, a theme park definitely fits the bill. So 2019, definitely one of the better years for Genting Malaysia, and 2020 and 2021, I guess you guys can see it was challenging, definitely. In Cambodia, they're already seeing a surge in Chinese tourists, even without the full opening of the border. And I think Malaysia will be no different. And even Genting's cruise operations could be a beneficiary, because cruise liners was one of the worst hits during COVID. Isolated, confined spaces, nobody wanted to travel. But hopefully normalcy will come probably second half of 2023, and probably better times in quarter 4 of 2023. Next, Malaysia airports, our tollkeeper. 2020, 2021, challenging times, least to say. And remember, every time you pass through an airport, there's actually airport tax, other ancillary revenues that the airport authorities would actually derive from passenger departures as well as arrivals. So, yeah, definitely on the books as well for the recovery of the tourism boom from China. So, this is something less obvious, healthcare, medical tourism. And as you can see from the chart, 2018, 2019, there was substantial growth in medical tourism in Malaysia. This is the number of people who traveled to Malaysia for healthcare, 2011 to 2019 of Statista. It's a growing trend. For many of you who may not realize that medical fees in Malaysia, for Malaysians, we look at it as expensive. But if you were to compare them to other countries around the region, including even Japan or even Indonesia, Malaysian medical fees are relatively cheap. Just to give you personal experience basis, I did a full medical checkup, I think probably about 2 months ago, in one of the leading healthcare providers in Malaysia, in KL. And it was packed. I kid you not, it was packed. And half of the room was filled with Indonesian Chinese. So, as you can see, it is a big sector that we should not ignore. The beneficiaries are there. And I'm going to talk about one specific company after this. Even though I put up KPJ Healthcare as an example, this doesn't necessarily mean that only KPJ will benefit. The other healthcare providers like IHH, Columbia Asia, Sign Medical, all potential beneficiaries. But the reason why I put KPJ Healthcare was because of their strategy of going into what we call second tier cities, examples like Sungai Petani in Kedah. And if these little bit more outskirts as compared to like main urban areas is their strategy, most people may find that the queue or the crowd is less there and they could potentially benefit as well. Even though they were an essential services during COVID, their profits also suffered, revenue also suffered because the priority was to treat COVID-related illnesses, a government agenda, and they are definitely looking forward to performing procedures that were postponed during that COVID period. So, yeah, one potential beneficiary, very resilient. Regardless of COVID, they still make money. Operating cash flow has been up, even though revenues have not jumped substantially. So definitely one of the potential beneficiaries of inbound Chinese tourists. So to conclude, these are the potential sectors that will benefit from the inbound Chinese tourists. The gatekeepers, obviously, Malaysia airports, hotels and resorts, Genting, YTL. The rest are a bit too fragmented, similar to that of the F&B segment. Now, the reason why I did not put in listed companies like TaxCam, who run the Sushi King franchise, is that as a tourist from China, you're likely going to eat local delicacies. And these are not listed conglomerates or companies that will directly benefit. And it's a very fragmented, but the inbound Chinese tourist has a multiplier effect because if these restaurants or local cuisines need to serve this kind of tourists, they'll hire people, incomes rise, hopefully, and they have spending capacity to actually spur on other economic activities. In aviation Asia, Malaysia Airlines is not listed. Obviously, the Chinese airlines would also benefit. But yeah, for this video, mainly Malaysian companies. Last but not least, don't overlook medical tourism. A lot of them did not manage to come to Malaysia to perform these procedures because it's an elective procedure and they definitely do not want to get infected by COVID. So yeah, I think a lot of these postponement elective procedures will come back in droves the moment some kind of normalcy happens in 2023. There you go. My thoughts on the opening up of the Chinese border. If you like content like this, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, so that the algorithm can spread it to more like-minded individuals like you. And do hit that notification bell if you want to be notified when my new videos are out. I'll see you guys in the next video.